Welcome to the Global Signal, where we explore how markets, policy, and strategic investment shape global power. I'm your host, Joshua Charles. Today we'll examine the growing role of private capital in Africa and the Middle East, from development finance to sovereign partnerships, and what this means for emerging flashpoints like Nigeria and Mali. Let's dive in. And on today's show, we have Christopher Riley, the CEO and founder of the Emagro Group, an advisory firm that bridges international public and private sector ambitions with trusted business partnerships in Africa and the Middle East. Christopher brings 20 years of experience as a national security strategist operating at the intersection of geopolitics, risk, and investment in some of the world's most complex regions. Throughout his career, he has built and led multi-agency teams tackling disinformation, illicit finance, terrorism, financial investment, and malign influence, working at the likes of the Department of State, the U.S. Department of State, Defense Intelligence Agency, and the U.S. Army Reserve, translating intelligence to support policy objectives and operational impact. His work has shaped U.S. engagement with heads of state, advised senior policymakers, and directly supported Fortune 500 CEOs at international summits. Today, Christopher is well recognized for his strengths in emerging market risk, capability building, and investment security, shaping the future of frontier market development with a U.S.-centric viewpoint. Chris, welcome to the Global Signal.
Thank you for having me. I'm privileged to be your second guest on the show, and certainly look forward to engaging with you this afternoon.
Christopher, we're going to take the conversation and focus on critical infrastructure investments in Africa, something that you have spent a significant amount of your career understanding, both from a public sector perspective and now a private sector perspective during your work at Emagro Group. I'd love for us to specifically hone in on infrastructure and strategic competition. When we look at Africa's infrastructure financing landscape, we all know that China, the United States, and Gulf investors are each taking distinct approaches. How do you assess America's current strategy for critical infrastructure investments on the continent, and what lessons can be drawn from China's model of state-backed finance?
Yeah, thanks, Joshua. No, I think your question is extremely relevant, particularly as it relates to kind of where the U.S. foreign policy posture is at right now, primarily focused on how do we increase access to critical minerals to help drive our defense industrial base and private sector interests. So when it comes to the current U.S. strategy on critical infrastructure and investment in Africa, I think is very reactionary right now. China and Russia have been very bullish in the space over the past 10 to 15 years. In the case of China, maybe a little less for Russia. And the United States has been we've been a bit slow to respond. So right now, I think it's very reactionary to our two primary competitors. I think moving forward, and kind of what lessons I guess we can kind of draw from this experience. I don't know maybe if the lessons are specific to China or just in general, but there's a big gap between the U.S. public and private sector community, and in the case of China and Russia, as you're aware, that gap is significantly less in comparison to the United States. More recently, I think this current administration has focused on decreasing that gap, and you see that in the form of the Office of Strategic Capital at the Pentagon, which is primarily focused on increasing collaboration and partnership with domestic mining and private sector companies in the kind of critical mineral space. But nonetheless, that's public-private partnership, right? Then separately, more recently, the Economic Defense Unit, which I believe is in the process of being stood up. I know a couple articles have been published about the new Pentagon office known as the Economic Defense Unit. And that aim for that office is to do some of the things that you kind of alluded to in terms of filling in that gap and being a opportunity to increase defense manufacturing and strengthen supply chain in a place like Africa, to help bridge the gap between some of our national security objectives and how we like to partner with private sector companies who may or may not be aware of the opportunities in a place like Africa. So those two new organizations are strong signs to me that the United States is seeing kind of where we can improve in terms of Africa based on kind of some of the successes that our competitors have had. And the way forward is going to be heavily built on folks like us being that bridge for U.S. private and public sector partnership. I think that's the kind of the lesson learned, if you will.
Chris, I love what you said on individuals like us bridging the gap in terms of private capital with respect to investments in Africa. I think there has been such a strong emphasis on ensuring that the government itself is supporting foreign assistance in ways that are beneficial in some regards, and perhaps in some ways could be improved upon, at least historically. I think the United States has done noteworthy things, and I think this is a time period where we will see more focused energy on corridors, on energy, assets that are imperative for the industrialization of Africa. And so we're seeing more private equity shops, development finance institutions, and sovereign partnerships increasingly deploy capital to these sectors. Now, let's take things back to a national security standpoint. How should Washington think about aligning private capital with strategic objectives? I think we're seeing a lot going on in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Perhaps you can speak on that, or any other countries deemed that it makes sense.
No, that's a great question. I could give you a very broad answer, or be on your show for the next 2 or 3 hours discussing that question. I would recommend starting with our economic officers assigned at embassies overseas, obviously in this case Africa, as well as some of our commercial officers from the Trade Bureau, who are also assigned to embassies in Africa. I tell folks all the time, like our foreign service officers that are on the economic track, as well as our commercial officers and folks involved in trade, are as critical as some of our traditional national security professionals when it comes to our country's future. A good example, you mentioned the DRC. Another good example is Cote d'Ivoire. In May, recently retired Ambassador Troy Fitrell, who was most recently the head of the Africa Bureau at the U.S. Department of State. He was a senior bureau official. He unveiled the department's new commercial strategy for Africa. And part of that strategy focused on working with the Ivorian Ministry of Trade and Industry in that commercial investment strategy that was unveiled, and also had an implementation plan. It was coordinated well with our embassy there, and a lot of that involved our trade and economic officers who aligned their interest obviously with some of our national security priorities as well, just based on what was kind of publicly discussed in some of the follow-on media articles. So that's a good example of our economic and trade officers engaging and then serving as a bridge, as I like to call it, to connect U.S. companies with opportunities in Cote d'Ivoire, that would help provide not only opportunities but also kind of shape the conversation with our Ivorian partners. So our Ivorian partners are already situated to receive U.S. companies who are interested in either investing or building or advancing whatever interest they may have in the country in Cote d'Ivoire.
This is really a dynamic time where I think we're seeing so much of an emphasis on on assets in a way that truly aligns with U.S. national interests. Clearly, if you look at U.S. foreign policy historically, there will be some touch points where this has been more evident. But I think clearly now it's a time where we are really seeing the future of U.S. foreign policy. And with that said, I think there's a lot that will unfold in the next 5 to 10 years with respect to U.S. Africa relations. And it's going to take an understanding of the geoeconomics, geopolitical actors, the sovereign wealth fund activities to capitalize on these countries, on these assets. But equally so, I will say, and I tell people often, if you follow the supranational flows, you can trace the capital flows. It may not be instantaneously, but I would argue that generally, if you look at the major powers and the superpowers in the world, you can delineate some information that allows you to understand, okay, what are the strategic partnerships that align with the United States? What are strategic partners that align with perhaps China or Saudi Arabia? And so even a few days ago, right, even this week, we've seen that one of the Gulf states leaders visit the White House and visit Washington D.C., as well as there was a really critical investment forum that took place. And so if we think about even Saudi's crown prince visiting Washington D.C., what do you think this signifies to the role that the Middle East is playing in various sectors, whether it be defense, energy, and tech, whether it be some of the different strategic partnerships when it comes to peace brokering agreements or negotiation processes?
Well, John, great. Another good question, and you definitely got my wheels turning. So I'll speak to the Gulf states in particular. I think over the past 3 or 4 years, both Saudi Arabia, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, as well as neighboring countries have done a good job of implementing their national diversification strategies. As you know, a lot of countries in the Gulf are heavily dependent on oil and gas as their primary source of economic revenue. You look at their GDPs, a lot of that is mostly based on oil and gas or tourism. And to the kingdom's credit, they've done a phenomenal job of diversifying and identifying other opportunities, whether that's strategic investment in Africa, in critical infrastructure, or whether that's looking for opportunities in the United States. A lot of Gulf countries have invested in the transportation industry, hotel industry in the United States. That's going to set them up well for the next two or three generations as oil and gas reserves decrease. In terms of what does this mean for them, I think it just, it continues to highlight I can't even call them emerging countries because they're here, but I think it further highlights the role that they're playing in terms of being involved in global conversations because they are a global player. I think for years, in the academic world, we've discussed the Middle East as emerging, or in particular the Gulf, as having future plans or future agenda as a regional power. In actuality, I think over the past 2 to 3 years, I've heard that less in terms of Gulf states being regional powers, and I've heard them more thought of as global players, and global players at a high level. So moving forward, I'm sure we're going to see more involvement and investment from Gulf countries. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, in particular, I think has done a phenomenal job of implementing what the royal family has kind of forecasted years ago in terms of opportunity in emerging markets like Africa, or strengthening ties to the United States. And this most recent trip by the head of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, as well as the investment forum that you spoke of, certainly highlight that.
I mean, let's look at some of the numbers. As you might be aware, the Qatari Sovereign Wealth Fund committed approximately 100 billion USD in investments in sub-Saharan Africa within the last few months. The United Arab Emirates also has an increasing influence on some foreign direct investments. So there's the investment components, but there's also the global conflict mediation standpoint, and so when we think about emerging middle powers and we think about the recalibration of the balance of power, how do you believe that the United States can facilitate forward-thinking partnerships that move the needle forward with respect to sub-Saharan Africa?
Well, you hit on the head, partnerships, right? And partnerships mean that there's a real relationship and that we're present to not only facilitate dialogue, but more importantly, to help grow and mature the relationship. I think right now, as I stated at the beginning of the conversation, I think we've been very reactionary, and I know several of my other colleagues, both current and former U.S. government folks who are very passionate about Africa, have echoed some of the same thoughts, that we've been very impulsive, if you will, in terms of what our U.S. Africa policy, especially as it relates to business and investment, is going to be here moving forward. I think in the future, to your point, in terms of partnerships, I think that starts with being present. And part of that presence means that we're treating African nations like we would treat any nation. And I think that also means that when we're seeking to interact with an African partner, that we're doing business, and businesses should in comparison to some other countries who haven't done this, but business should be fair, right? Local content laws should be prioritized, and the United States government, as well as the U.S. private sector, should make it a point to be present. And you hear me say present a lot, because we currently aren't as present as we should be, but that the United States make it a point to be present. And what to me presence means being on the ground and doing the things like carving out a footprint, a physical presence, either in the form of U.S. academic institutions who have a satellite institution in Africa, or U.S. businesses having factories in Africa, either owned by a subsidiary group, or owned outright by a U.S. company. So I think once we start to do these things more, I think U.S. relations in Africa will certainly increase.
Christopher, you basically touched upon themes of a cross-comparative analysis regarding the Gulf states, China, the United States, and something that can be extrapolated to other powers in the world. Let's lean in on the work that Washington is doing. You mentioned that the United States, that we could be doing more, and I think that with time and forward thinking policy initiatives and incentive mechanisms, that we will get there. So I remain optimistic. But leading into some of these actual tools that we have, whether it be on the economic side of things with the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, or whether it be on the military side of things with the United States Africa Command, we have several tools that we currently use to shape our interest on the continent. Where do these tools fall short compared to nations like China or the UAE or Saudi Arabia at that?
Yeah, Joshua, that's a good question. I don't know if in terms of comparing kind of how U.S. You mentioned the defense community and some of the tools that we have to potentially offer or exchange in terms of defense sales with African partners. I think this current administration has obviously changed the posture a bit. When we think of defense cooperation and security assistance in Africa, typically we're thinking about counterterrorism support, and we're thinking about U.S. military folks training partner nations and doing things like assisting and advising partner nations, and also doing low-level defense sales with partner nations. More recently, I think that's changed a little bit. You mentioned UAE and China. China has obviously kind of expanded to some degree, slightly, its defense cooperation in Africa. The UAE has increased quite a bit in terms of defense cooperation and defense sales. Turkey as well. I know you mentioned Turkey, but Turkey is also kind of like, in a way, kind of filled the vacuum that the United States has kind of left to some degree in terms of training African partners, as well as offering defense tools like drones. I know the UAE has also done similar sales in terms of the drones, UAS assets to African partners. And my understanding is that, just based on conversations with current friends in the region, the UAE is seeking to be a much larger player in the defense space, in part to kind of fill some of that vacuum that the United States left. So I feel like Washington has, and this is a positive. I feel like we've done a good job of recognizing the potential now, where in the past a lot of folks who primarily focus on Africa can see the potential, but I feel like non-Africa watchers have recognized not only the potential that the continent has to offer, but also the critical nature of U.S. Africa relationships in terms of our country's future. I think moving forward in terms of falling short, I think the fall short would be if we don't maximize the potential that we've recognized. I think that would be an area where potential. So right now it's hard for me to gauge, kind of say, hey, here's where we've fallen short. But I think moving forward, if we look back at this time 5 to 10 years down the road, and we say, hey, this is we recognize a gap, or we recognize an issue, and we feel that at filling that gap, I think down the road we can better assess kind of where we're falling short right now in 2025. One thing that's unique to the U.S. is, in comparison to some of the countries that you mentioned, China and Russia specifically, China, is that we tend to plan in these 4-year policy blocks, right? Every president has a 4-year term. Every 4 years, our strategy changes. China doesn't plan that way. And over the past 15 to 20 years, China's relationship with Africa has been able to grow exponentially because of that, ability to be consistent in its approach and in its strategy. So I'm looking forward to now that I'm looking forward to U.S. government and the U.S. private sector community saying, okay, now that we've recognized an area where we can make money and we can strengthen our country's future, now let's take advantage of it, right? So in the future, I think once we look back at kind of where we are now, I think we'll be able to better assess kind of areas where we were successful, or areas that we fell short.
Now we're widening the gamut to think about not just Africa, but Asia, Latin America, Europe, Australia. The list goes on and on in terms of different islands and what have you. And so one of the key things that we have to discuss when it comes to having this current conversation is, what do policymakers need to do, or what could they do to balance security, development, and private sector engagement to build sustainable and resilient infrastructure abroad? This could be with respect to Panama. This could be with respect to the Lobito corridor. This can be with respect to developments in Asia.
Yeah, the saying that's kind of resurfaced over the past year or so has been trade, not aid, right? And prioritizing money-making opportunities that still align with some of the things that you mentioned, in particular security and development, are critical. I think the more policymakers, especially folks who have in the case of elected officials, folks that have constituents who are serious business people, and people who've made a lot of money in certain sectors that have yet to be fully tapped into in Africa. I think policymakers working with those folks and getting them to some of the places that you just highlighted is kind of their role in this, right? Whether that's having a local business forum, or connecting local business forums and local business organizations, connecting them with embassies in countries of interest, whether that's working with companies who have expressed a desire to take advantage of some of the opportunities that Africa and other emerging markets may have to offer, and then doing their best to work with those companies to make sure that they're maximizing their ability to take advantage of some of those opportunities. I think that's their role. So if you look at it in terms of like being that bridge that I said you and I are at the earlier part of the conversation, I think policymakers who are increasingly focused on kind of how do we generate revenue for America, prioritize American interests, I think those policymakers should continue to do that. But I would also recommend identifying opportunities that fit well with current companies' agenda and where companies want to go, right? Whether that's scalability, whether that's attractive labor costs, whether that's working with companies to identify their interests, and then engaging with foreign partners either via an embassy or directly to see how those interests align with engagement with a foreign partner.
I have gone to several countries across the world, in Latin America and Africa and Europe and in Asia. And I think especially as I've matured in the private sector, I've realized how much of a role the U.S. Embassy can play. Can you speak on that so people understand the importance of receiving vetted information from trusted individuals who represent the U.S. government and thus the best interests of the United States?
Yeah, absolutely, Joshua. So at the beginning of our chat, I discussed the role of some of our economic officers at embassies and consulates abroad, as well as some of our commercial officers. Their job and their role is to help facilitate communication between U.S. businesses and the government that they're in, or with companies in the country that they're in. That's their role, right? So they're going to understand the business landscape. They're going to understand some of the intricate details within the country that most folks just aren't going to be able to understand because they aren't there every day, or they haven't had the time to build those vital relationships that allow business people to be successful. So in terms of their value, they can be that vetting tool that a lot of companies just don't have access to, or companies are a bit concerned that they're going to have to pay an organization a lot of money to do that on their behalf, which is still good to do. Don't get me wrong. You and I would appreciate the business, but the reality is it's always good to utilize an embassy officer who's at a country that that officer has built those relationships, and that officer has spent a considerable amount of time in the country. Getting those atmospherics, getting those details are certainly helpful in terms of business, and also helpful deciding if it's worth the potential risk, right? Because there's always a risk. It may not be as significant as a lot of Americans think as it relates to Africa, but there's still a risk there. So part of what I would recommend in response to your question is for companies to engage with folks here in Washington, D.C. At the U.S. State Department, or some of our colleagues, some of the folks at trade, prior to engaging with an embassy, just to make sure that what they're seeking to do is worth their time and worth the time of U.S. officers overseas.
Christopher, as you know, there has been a lot of recent narratives around attacks on Christians in Nigeria. This has made so many headlines. There's been talk about potential U.S. involvement, potential interventions. And so from your perspective, Christopher, how should policymakers discern between legitimate humanitarian concerns and narratives that risk entangling the U.S. in complex internal dynamics? I'm sure, Christopher, by now you've gotten about 20,000 calls regarding this, and so I think there are a few people better suited to speak on this than yourself.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Joshua. It's unique, and I tell folks, going back to now deceased former President Muhammadu Buhari, Nigeria's former president, while he was in D.C., I believe in 2018, I think, 2018 or 2019, during his engagement in Washington, D.C., President Trump asked him about atrocities being committed against Christians. Nigeria, as you're aware, is a very unique country, not only because it is a strong, not only because it's large, right? 200 million people, most of which are very hardworking, awesome people. We see amazing things from the Nigerian diaspora, both here in the United States as well as other countries. The internal dynamics that you highlighted are extremely interesting, right? Because you have an extremely diverse country, both Christian and Muslim. The Muslim North is probably about like 98% Muslim, right? And then once you move to like the Central Belt, it's Muslim and Christian. And historically, that's where a lot of the communal violence happens, in places like Jos, located in Plateau State, or in Kaduna, which is like north central Nigeria, just north of Abuja, Kaduna North. Every so often there's communal violence, but that communal violence is often communicated in the media as violence against Christians. Now, what I will say is that over the past, maybe 6, 7, 8, maybe almost 10 years, there has been an increase in atrocities committed against primarily Christian communities by herdsmen who are predominantly members of the Fulani ethnic group. And as you know, the Fulani ethnic group is very nomadic. So oftentimes there's Fulani from Nigeria, Fulani from Niger, Fulani from northern Cameroon, And according to a lot of my friends in Nigeria who work in the security space, they said, Chris, a lot of these atrocities that are committed against Christians aren't necessarily religious based, even though they slightly can be. But I always look at and define motivation, right? So the motivation sometimes is I am a herdsman, I have cows, and I can't graze my cows on a farmer's land. And it's less based on ideology or belief. So when we look at the motivation behind some of the atrocities that are unfortunately committed against primarily Christians, you ask yourself, what's the motivation? What's the driving factor behind the violence? Is it ideology, or is it economic, or is it communal in terms of space? So these are some of the things that I don't think were communicated well after we announced, we being the U.S. government, announced a concern about atrocities committed against Christians. It's unfortunate. Does it happen? Absolutely, but I don't know if the violence is specific to Nigerians of Christian faith based on their beliefs, and more so based on their location or the communities that they're in. And that's, like I said, whether that's being associated with land, and how herdsmen seek to graze their cows on the land that some of these individuals who happen to be Christian live, or whether it's political in terms of some of the areas that I previously highlighted in the Central Belt and in North Central Nigeria, where oftentimes religion can be politicized. So as you stated at the beginning of the topic, it's very complex. It's a very complex situation. Now, what I will say is that in the northeastern pocket of Nigeria, which has historically kind of been the center of gravity, or kind of base of operations, if you will, for ISIS West Africa, one of the largest ISIS affiliates in the world, as well as Boko Haram, its predecessor group, which I believe still has a separate remnant that operates outside of ISIS West Africa. That group has killed a lot of Christians, and in their communications, they've been very public about violence aimed at Christians based on belief and ideology, which is separate from violence in the places that I highlighted in northern Kaduna, or places like Plateau State, in Jos, Plateau State, or other places in the country. Especially that like central swath of land, right, where north kind of meets south, and communities kind of integrate. And as I stated, you have a separate kind of series of violent episodes that are conducted by herdsmen, which it's always been debatable if those herdsmen have ties to Boko Haram, ISIS West Africa. It's possible on some level or working level, but their violence may not necessarily be attributed or associated with the type of violence being carried out by ISIS West Africa, Boko Haram. But if you look at local media outlets, sometimes they're often conflated, right? Whereas like Boko Haram or ISIS West Africa conducts the attack, in actuality, it's the herdsmen who aren't motivated by ideology or religion. So where's the U.S. role in that? I think given the complexity and given the dynamics, I think the United States would first and foremost do itself a service by working through the Nigerian government, right, to better understand what's going on the ground, and then also understanding how we can best support. So if that's increasing our CT cooperation, which has historically been how we've kind of engaged with Nigeria in the security space, through training, or potentially providing equipment. A couple years ago, we provided some close air support planes, right, to help provide close air support in the northeastern pocket where Boko Haram and ISIS West Africa are at. Called Super Tucanos. We United States government help facilitate those to the Nigerian Ministry of Defense. So I think that'd be the first step, right? If I were, recommending a senior policymaker or someone in the White House, kind of, okay, hey, what do we do? What does it look like? I'll say, well, first and foremost, let's work with the Nigerians, right? Let's see if these violent episodes are related, as it's likely that they aren't. And then I'll work with our partners on real solutions. Right, I think the immediate may be additional CT cooperation, as I stated, and then I think the midterm may be business jobs. Right, oftentimes, one of the primary drivers of violence, whether it be motivated by ideology, whether it's motivated by um, land, space, or resources, has been the lack of jobs, lack of money. So if the United States government wanted to increase revenue making opportunities for U.S. businesses, I tell folks all the time, one of the great things about Nigeria is that the cost of labor is fairly cheap, and there's some amazing, highly qualified people. Right, I tell folks Nigeria's strength is in its population. It's almost 200 million people, most of whom are Anglophone, are English speaking. And as seen by the Nigerian diaspora in the United States and in the UK and other countries, the aptitude for success, especially in some of the technical career fields, is very high with Nigerians. Um, so yeah, I think if that answers your question. I know that's a very long response, but as you can tell, I spent a little bit of time working the topic, and certainly enjoy. I've enjoyed my time in Nigeria working with our partners there, and I'm actually in the process of highlighting some opportunities in northern Nigeria, north central Nigeria. Joshua, look, I've spent time in north central. I spent time in the far northern part of the country. By background, I'm not Muslim. I do have a lot of Muslim friends and loved ones, but I felt at home there. I felt at home, and more importantly, I look forward, now that I'm in the private sector, of assisting U.S. companies who are looking for those opportunities that I highlighted throughout this conversation, because I've seen several in northern Nigeria, in the far north in particular. I think oftentimes when we look at the media and we hear about violent attacks, or we hear about terrorism, and then as professionals in the space, you or I will look at the numbers like, hey, well, it's only a handful of attacks there, or it was a small arms attack, and then we compare that to violence in major cities in the United States. Right, there's still a bit of a gap there, right, where some of these places that people think are dangerous aren't as dangerous. Now, don't get me wrong. There's obviously need for security, and I'm happy to advise and kind of help provide that security. But in comparison to violent attacks and overall, uh, landscape not being what a business owner or entrepreneur may think it needs to be prior to investment, oftentimes the reality isn't communicated in media or in press as well as it could be, and that's where I think folks like myself or you can help better illustrate the risk and the reality on the ground.
Oftentimes, in some of these emerging and frontier markets, Christopher, and you've alluded to this, is there's this pronounced perception of risk that I would argue seldom exists on the ground as it's portrayed on media. Now, here's the kicker. When we look at Nigeria, Nigeria has the booming rates of population growth, energy potential. There's also trade risks associated with what we see on media, what you touched upon and what I have touched upon right now. And so, what is the U.S. risk by misunderstanding Nigeria's internal dynamics? And how might this shape institutional investment flows? Let's think about portfolio managers, right? If the United States, the most powerful nation in the world, portrays certain risks, clearly there's going to be a domino effect. in terms of some of the risk mitigation strategies that these institutional investors take. So can you speak on that?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, Nigeria is one of the largest economies on the continent, right? And I highlighted the size of the country, but I often tell folks, you look at the country, you also have to include the diaspora. So Nigeria has a huge diaspora, as you're aware, Joshua, and that diaspora is relevant because they send a lot of money via remittances back to Nigeria. So economically, I always tell folks, when you look at Nigeria, you have to include the diaspora. The United States, in terms of our influence in Africa, based on what I just described, right? Nigeria, our relationship with Nigeria, which is often underscored by the size of the Nigerian diaspora in the United States, as well as the Nigerian oil and gas deposits, which may not be as critical to the United States energy cycle as it once was. But I tell folks all the time, we don't want to create another vacuum for another country to potentially come in and provide some of the partnership and provide some of the interaction that the U.S. Has historically provided in Nigeria. Nigeria's neighbor in Niger, as well as neighboring countries who aren't necessarily direct neighbors, but Mali and Burkina Faso, for example, they have obviously felt a shift in those countries and have chosen to further align with Russia versus their historical partner, which has been the former colonial power in France. So that's a to answer your question, that's kind of like a doomsday, if you will, example. But I tell folks all the time that countries can decide who they partner with and who they work with. Why wouldn't we want to prioritize a country like Nigeria, who has already kind of communicated to the world their relationship with the United States, right, which is largely predicated on the size of the diaspora here, as well as some of the same cultural ties, if you will, whether it be language, religion to a degree. So many Nigerian professionals and business owners go to school in the United States. So what we run risk of is potentially losing influence in a key country, right, that matters to not only the national security space, but also in terms of that, multi-generational forecast for the United States economically. I tell folks all the time, and I kind of highlighted this a minute ago, separate from the hydrocarbon space, separate from oil and gas, Nigeria has a lot of people, and in that there's a lot of potential. And I'm starting to see the tech industry, U.S. tech industry, realize that there's opportunity in Nigeria's huge population. So I think Nigeria's best days are in front of her, and so to speak, in terms of opportunities. And I would hate for the United States to miss out on that. Because we aren't present, or because we don't value what Nigeria could potentially bring.
Christopher, as you know, there's been a lot of buzz regarding the jihadist takeover in Mali. What's your prognosis of the current instability in Bamako? What does this mean for the state of the Malian economy? And do you believe the tension between the Malian government and the rebel forces will worsen before it becomes better?
I mean, look, I tell folks all the time, Mali's interesting because a lot of what we're seeing right now in November 2025 traces back to 2012 and the French intervention, where it looked as if Mali looked very similar to what it looks like now in 2012, where Algerian Al-Qaeda affiliated and Al-Qaeda members, right? Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, the largest Al-Qaeda affiliate in the region, were driving Toyota Hilux trucks south to Bamako, and it looked as if they were potentially going to make a serious attempt to take over the country by taking over the capital in Bamako, prior to the French airborne folks conducting an intervention in 2012, and kind of stabilized things. I believe that's more commonly known as Operation Serval back in 2012 for all my African history folks and military security watchers, African security watchers out there. More recently, and I tell folks all the time, I think over the past couple of years, what we saw is the Al Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, as well as their primary affiliate, JNIM or JNIM, which is comprised of a couple Mali-based predecessor terrorist groups. We've seen them diversify a little bit. So back in 2012, I think it was a largely kind of like Algerian-led leadership cadre. And then 2018, 2017, 2018, there were Algerian leaders who relocated to Mali, most notably the group's leader, Abdelmalek Droukdal, who was killed in I believe a U.S. or U.S. and French operation. It may have just been a French operation, which kind of like spelled out Mali's importance for Al Qaeda and spelled out Mali's importance for terrorist groups as a sanctuary. And then more recently, the past couple of years, is based on their terrorist media, as you stated. One of my former roles was countering disinformation and malign influence. And over the past couple of years, a group that was primarily made up of northern Malians has kind of expanded their scope, so to speak, and included Malians from central and southern part of Mali, most notably kind of co-opting local groups like Messina Liberation Front, which is primarily made up of ethnic Fulanis, as well as ethnic Bambaras from central and southern Mali have now joined JNIM, as well as other Al-Qaeda aligned remnants there in Mali that are aiding or supporting JNIM. So I feel like based on the lack of governance, right, and the terrorist groups have been able to take advantage of these undergoverned spaces, which has allowed them to gain rapport in these communities by providing basic services, whether that's food, whether that's water, other things that folks may be interested in. I think their communications and propaganda, their media strategy has been pretty significant over the past couple of years in comparison to where it once was. I think with the past couple of years, JNM and its affiliates have created a more of a local appeal, if you will, to groups in central and southern Mali, allowing them to kind of expand their influence. What does this mean for the state of Mali's economy? Well, if you look at kind of where things are, and I kind of highlighted this in a previous topic, Mali, as you're aware, Joshua, decided to kind of sever ties with France over the past few years. And previously, Mali used France's military to provide security and traditional kinetic and non-kinetic counterterrorism operations. So both lethal and non-lethal counterterrorism operations. That hasn't been there. What does that mean for its economy? Well, the economy was already fragile, right? So now it's even worse. I think the United States in July had two separate representatives to Bamako to discuss expanding U.S. Malian business ties. I think this is based on local press reporting that the discussion largely centered around gold and other minerals. I think that is obviously derailed if it was something that was in motion prior to the current security situation kind of unraveling. Moving forward, I wouldn't expect the Malians to focus on their economy right now. I think right now they're just trying to stay intact as a government, and kind of what that looks like moving forward. Mali needs to, if they haven't already, start to engage at a high level with its neighbors to figure out how they can support with its security right now, especially given the severed ties with France. And I don't know if there's been any U.S. outreach or engagement in terms of security assistance. You know, maybe the Malian government thinks about engaging with Washington to see what support, if any, they can receive. And if you look at going back to your points, going back to your earlier question about like U.S. Relations in Africa and what the White House calls deal making, right? Making these deals which are somewhat reactive. Maybe Mali, similar to the DRC, may want to take advantage of that, right? Where the Malians would receive U.S. support for security, and the United States receive access to critical minerals, or at the very least, valuable minerals like gold. As you're aware, Mali has a lot of gold. So moving forward, it's a sticky situation. It's a sticky situation that I think people in the African security community have been very concerned about for a very long time, going back to 2012. As I highlighted, going back to 2012, Mali looked very much like it looks right now, like it potentially would be engulfed by local terrorists, and that's unfortunate. But we hope that there's a solution there soon. So.
The solution, I believe, can come potentially from the United States. When you consider some of the migrational flows, some of the surrounding countries of around Mali, they are receiving some immigrants. So clearly this, and I hope this is something that gets you and the Emagro Group several calls, whether it be from the Trump administration officials or interested commercial operators and investors. But let's look at how the Trump administration can support some of these migrational flows. From reported incidents of conflict in Mali, is this something that you think the Trump administration is willing to do? And if so, in what capacity?
I think willingness is largely based in the value for the United States. And I don't know what the value is right now. As I stated earlier, I think if the Malians were to create a favorable package to the United States government focused on access to gold or other minerals of interest, maybe that leads to conversations about close air support. I think a week ago, the Malians were interested in acquiring drones, I believe, from I forgot which nation, but obviously the U.S. could certainly help. But what that looks like in terms of support to the migrational flows, I don't know. If there's no explicit value that benefits the United States. Now, if you're in Bamako, this is an opportunity, right, to not only re-engage the United States and strengthen ties, but also to stay afloat, right, to save yourself. Obviously, the junta government is under extreme pressure right now. And a lot of the promises that the government made to decrease terrorism, to increase security, unfortunately, they haven't been able to follow through on those promises. So maybe this could be a signal for a restart with Washington. If you're in Bamako, and kind of what that looks like is, to putting together a favorable package. And realistically, I think the package is focused on immediate support to sustain the current administration, to sustain the current leadership regime. And then allowing the United States to kind of craft what benefits the U.S. government. And I think that may work well for Mali. But right now, it's a really, really bad situation because, as I stated to you, Mali requests France to leave, which has historically done a lot of the heavy lifting, along with Malian forces. I don't want to discredit or exclude them from the conversation. But France has done a lot with Mali to ensure Mali's security, especially when it comes to counterterrorism. So now that France is no longer in the picture and the country is about to be taken over potentially by terrorists, by members of Al Qaeda, I think if you're Bamako, you don't have as much leveraging power as you once did. But at the same time, maybe this is an opportunity, right, to kind of re-engage the United States and reinvigorate ties. In terms of the migrational flow, I'm thinking about it, and I don't know if there is an opportunity, but there may be an opportunity, especially as this administration kind of restructures what was formerly USAID, which is now is a different entity within the U.S. Department of State, but does some of the same functions. I think once that conversation is had between Bamako and Washington, if it hasn't been had already, I think it's largely focused on how do you U.S. government, how can you help us stay in power, and then go forward from there.
Christopher, any last second thoughts as we wrap up this episode?
Yeah, absolutely, Joshua. First off, I appreciate you giving me an opportunity to join you on your podcast, and certainly value all the great things that you do. And just to further reiterate the critical kind of state that we're in as entrepreneurs focused on Africa, security professionals focused on Africa, I think the United States has a significant opportunity in front of them. And I think more folks like you and I can help be that public-private sector partnership bridge and facilitator that we spoke about at the top of the conversation. So, hey, man, I value what you do, and look forward to participating in the future podcast in the coming months.
Christopher, this has been an incredibly rich conversation, one that cuts across finance, diplomacy, security, the fast-changing dynamics shaping Africa, the Middle East, and the broader geopolitical landscape. What stands out across all of your insights is a core theme. The world is entering an era where capital, infrastructure, and influence are inseparable. Whether we're talking about the strategic behavior of Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds, China's state-backed financing model in Africa, or the US's evolving use of economic statecraft, it's clear that power today is being exercised as much through investment portfolios and supply chains as through military bases and alliances. Your perspective helps illuminate how Washington can better integrate its economic and security tools, how private capital can be aligned with national strategic objectives, and how key countries such as Nigeria and Mali and others fit into a new multipolar order that is still taking shape. And as you've reminded us throughout this discussion, the stakes are not abstract. They shape livelihoods, migration patterns, regional stability, and the long-term strategic posture of the United States. For our listeners, I think the takeaway is this. The next decade will be defined by those who can navigate complexity, who can understand that infrastructure is diplomacy and finance is influence, and that narratives can escalate into real consequences if not grounded in a deep understanding of local realities. Christopher, thank you for bringing your 2 decades of experience across intelligence, development, and investment to this conversation. Your ability to translate events on the ground into strategic insight is invaluable, and I know our audience will walk away with a clearer sense of how to think about these challenges at a time when the global order is being rewritten in real time. Folks, we'll leave it there for today. Thank you all for listening to The Global Signal, and stay tuned for our next episode